Hello, everyone. This is Chris Grosso with the IndieSpirituals.com. I'm joined today with Diane Hamilton. Diane has been a practitioner of meditation for almost 30 years. She began her studies at Naropa University in 1983 with Choygam Trungpa Rinpoche and became a Zen student of Genpo Roshi's in 1997. In 2003, she received ordination as a Zen monk with her husband Michael Zimmerman and received a dharma transmission from Roshi in 2006. Diane facilitates Big Mind, Big Heart, a process developed by Genpo Roshi to help elicit the insights of Zen in Western audiences. She's worked with Ken Wilber and the Integral Institute since 2004. Diane, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And I should show everyone before we get started, this is Diane's wonderful book, which I really appreciate. It's called Everything is Workable. And the funny thing, Diane, is I'd asked people on my own Facebook page, what they're reading currently. This was probably about 2 weeks ago, and someone had mentioned your book. I'm like, oh wow, I'm interviewing Diane in 2 weeks. So it's great that it's out there. People are enjoying it and appreciating it.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was kind of wonderful to do, and I really have to give a lot of credit to Shambhala Publications, particularly to David O'Neill, who was my editor, because he approached me about putting it together, and then he was such a both supportive and very, very precise in terms of his editing. So it was a kind of a wonderful experience. I've never done it before, so I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I've heard great things about the guys at Shambhala, so that's wonderful. You had a good experience.
Yeah, I had a great one.
Cool. So I wanted to start towards the beginning, and I tend not to start on a somber note, but I think this is a really important part of your story. So you write that it was at the age of 17 that you experienced, well, it was very heavy life circumstances where 7 of your friends died, and well, again, I don't want to bring up painful memories.
Oh, it's fine.
But it seems like that was a huge catalyst for you in your spiritual endeavor, and I'd love if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that and your initial experiences and stages in your spiritual journey.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Well, when we explore this question of, what prompted our seeking, because those of us who have been spiritual seekers, some people, just suddenly started to wonder who they were, or some people, I know a friend of mine who's a spiritual teacher, she just was sitting at her desk one day and suddenly felt enveloped in this quality of unconditional love. She just dropped out of the sky, and she spent pretty much the rest of her life integrating and working with that experience. And for me, it was maybe a little bit more like the story of the Buddha himself, where when he crossed the boundaries of his conventional life and encountered birth, old age, sickness, and death, and that's what catapulted him into his search and his eventual awakening. And for me, I was, going along as an American girl. I grew up in the West. I'm kind of a cowgirl. I rode horses a lot. I think that's partly how I learned to meditate, was just really long afternoons by myself. And when I was 17, there were a series of incidents and accidents that occurred. So 4 of my good friends were killed in a light plane. I think it was a Friday the 13th in February.
Wow.
And one of my friends had just received his pilot's license, and 3 others piled in the plane with him. And they went up in a nearby canyon to look at elk. And because he was an inexperienced pilot, everybody kind of surmises that he just didn't gain altitude properly, and basically they crashed into the mountain. And they found the plane 2 months later because there was a snowstorm after that. So there was this period also where they were lost.
Jeez.
Yeah, and then believe it or not, about 1 week after those funerals in April, the sister of one of my friends was killed in an automobile accident. So that happened. Another friend died in a knife fight, believe it or not. Someone had stolen his cassette, back in those days, an 8-track cassette player, and he knew who it was. It turns out that it was somebody who'd just been released from prison periodically. So he went into the restaurant where this person was working in the back as a cook. Believe it or not, my friend was 18 years old. The guy ran to the back of the kitchen, grabbed a knife, came out and plunged it into my friend's heart, who was 18 years old. Wow. Isn't that amazing?
That is, yeah, wow.
Yeah, it was just incredible. And then the final one, believe it or not, was a friend who was older. He was one of my very close friends' older brother. And he, believe it or not, committed suicide, and he was a chemist, and he did it by taking cyanide.
Wow.
So, yeah. So these were like, within that very brief period of time, just like trauma and loss and ambiguity and, violence and despair, just kind of all these flavors that sort of got thrown up in my field.
Jeez,
At a
17.
period of time. Yeah, I was 17. And it just, it was one of those, I mean, there's so many people around the world that have endured really, really difficult things.
Right.
But for my spiritual opening, I just had to reconcile myself to those events. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean that people can end their life? What does it mean that people can be murdered when they're only 18 years old? Those kinds of questions. So that's really what prompted my search, was that series of events.
And I love that you mentioned that those were, those questions, that those are the deeper questions that bring a lot of us to the spiritual path. I was speaking with another author the other day. Her name's Sarah Beek, wonderful writer. And we were discussing how a lot of people, at least most people that I've met, don't come to the spiritual path because their life is filled with rainbows and unicorns. A lot of the times it is heavy stuff, existential questions that we just need answering. So,
that's right.
But yeah, thank you for sharing so openly about that, because it's important for people to hear it. These things happen, but there can be grace through that. But so if you can walk me through a little bit, then your initial exploration of spirituality, and then we're going to get into your book in a second. But did you find that Buddhism right off the bat was what resonated with you, or did you seek out different lineages or books, or what did that look like for you?
Well, it prompted the questions, and so I guess you could say that I began a period of questioning, of searching, of thinking. And for me, I went towards the Western philosophical tradition first, and I became a student of philosophy. And interestingly enough, at the time, Zen Master Bankei says that until you close the gap between subject and object, the scratch doesn't get itched, or the itch doesn't get scratched, or the itch becomes the scratch, whatever it is. So I actually had that experience that I didn't have the kind of guidance in the Western philosophical tradition that subject-object gap could be condensed. I'm sure it exists there somewhere. Certainly within the mystical traditions in the West, it exists. So I always felt uneasy, even though I was taking it in and doing my best to work with these philosophical perspectives. And then I was drawn to, I think, directly to the work of Choygam Trungpa. And that was in about 1982. So then I decided to go to Naropa Institute, partly out of practicality. I had a degree in philosophy and literature, and I needed to be employed. So I made a decision to go into psychology, but I was drawn to Naropa Institute. I wanted a more experiential education, and what I was calling experiential in a certain way was really the impulse to want kind of body and mind to come together, you might say. So through the practice and through Choygam Trungpa's teachings, my first experiences of non-duality, and that is just so relieving to the body-mind. So for me, it's kind of been, like every person, I've had ins and outs and ups and downs with this practice, but it answered an existential longing in me that, now at this stage I can fill it out with Sufi teaching and the Christian mystics and lessons from Kabbalah, whatnot. But it provides a real, Zen particularly, a real basis for my spiritual life.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah, thank you very much, Diane.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So you start the book off with a chapter titled "Conflict is Good News." And there's a particular sentence that I appreciated, and you wrote, "To learn to transform conflict, we must let go of the notion that something or someone is wrong or bad." Love that. And I would love for you if you can discuss that a little bit and elaborate further on that for our viewers.
Well, one of the things that is very important is that my book, I was influenced by Choygam Trungpa's Buddhist teachings early, and then my own teacher, Genpo Roshi. And then I was introduced to Ken Wilber, as you know, in about 2004. He's had incredible impact on my way of seeing and my way of working with myself. So in an evolutionary context, human beings were probably the most dangerous animal to one another. In fact, I've heard some statistic like you were more likely to be killed by another human being than you were by another animal in nature. So just because of our predatory and warring histories, conflict is serious business.
Yeah.
Conflict has the potential to be extremely dangerous. So people's first response, if the nervous system, the reptilian brain is stimulated, the amygdala fires, cortisol is dumped into the body, adrenaline. So all of those sensations say, this shouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
And they say it, they give us that information for very, very good reason. Problem is in most of the conflicts that we're in, our life is not at stake. It's just simply an evolutionary vestige, I guess you could say, that organizes us in a particular way, but that organization keeps us from actually becoming very skillful. So some of us tend to mute those sensations. Some of us withdraw and react to those sensations. Some of us have a more aggressive response. But the first thing to do is to work with recognizing the feeling state in the body whenever you're in a conflict, and realize that the old part of who you are is online. There's a threat in the system. It's doing its job. But what's cool is that the neocortex shuts down when the reptilian brain is stimulated.
Yeah.
And when the amygdala fires. But by witnessing, which is what we use in meditation, by witnessing these sensations, we actually can reinterpret them. So we can rewire the brain so that the neocortex can stay online while we're feeling threatened and all of that. So the next step, once you've felt the sensation, is to relinquish your idea about the conflict, because inevitably you're thinking something generally about somebody else. Something's doing something wrong. Somebody's doing something, inevitably there's a pushing away almost of that. So if you can kind of release that, then you open the possibility for it to be worked with creatively. But you got to deal with the body, and you have to deal with the thoughts.
Yeah, and thanks for saying that. I'm a recovering addict myself, and you just discussing about our old reptilian brain and how the neocortex shuts down. I was reading John Dupree's book, Integral Recovery, which shines a great light on that for people in my situation. But it's not just for people in recovery from a drug. Like you said, it's our natural state of being. So that's certainly very important, and it's great to see people shining a light on that and bringing that to the forefront of an integral part of our practice. I know you talk a lot about shadow work, and that's very important as well. So thanks for touching on that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a long-winded answer. I apologize.
No, I prefer those. I don't like the soundbitey answers. So thank you for that.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Okay.
So you also talk about encountering fear in the scary yet exciting chapter. And I'm going to share another quote from that you'd written. If we can learn to relate with fear directly, not trying to get rid of it, but becoming aware of what it looks like, tastes like, and feels like in our mind and body, we can develop fearlessness. That's another one I would love for you. If you could talk a bit about that as well, that'd be great.
If you think about it, one of the what we do in practice is we move from identification with what we might call the egoic self. And if you think about the egoic self, it's this separate body, this separate set of strivings, this separate set of aspirations. So there's a lot of stress when we're coming from the egoic state of mind. And practice really helps us shift, first of all, relax that, so that we can open up to greater identity and therefore have greater fluidity in our lives. Now, of course, what we're going to encounter at a certain point is some kind of fundamental fear, right? Because the egocentric self is stressed, but if you look even deeper, the egocentric self is in a state of fear because we're separate from reality. Not only are we separate, but we have to ensure our safety. So, it's up to me to make sure I survive. So there's just a very deep level at which each of us is afraid to some degree of existence precisely because we're afraid of non-existence. We're afraid of death. And so really learning how to, particularly in sitting meditation, become sensitive to what fear states are like in the body. They're interesting, at least in my mind, because sometimes it could be just like simple anxiety. You can feel your heart rate increase. You can feel your neck flush or a cramping in your solar plexus. But other times, fear takes on almost a It's very hard to even know what it is. And sometimes it takes on a quality of even terror or dread. But there's really nothing to kind of get a hold of other than this feeling of great unease. And every time you go to try to note where it is in your body, it sort of, eludes you in a way.
Yeah.
So learning how to make contact with these different styles of fear, these different qualities of fear, becoming familiar with them, then basically you can start to ask yourself the question, well, what is it that's aware of the fear? Right? What is actually being aware of the fear? So this space of awareness, this kind of unconditioned quality of awareness that actually can become aware of fear, can hold, if you will, or at least there's a space for the fear to arise. So the identification from the fear itself to the space around the fear, there's just so much more room. And then gradually what happens is that the fear just kind of, the body mind is quick. You think about animals in the wild, they get chased, prey, spend your whole day as a rabbit. You got a lot of fear rushing through the body. So the body can restabilize relatively quickly, but in our case, only when we do it consciously, because otherwise we're unconsciously feeding it with all kinds of cognition.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. It's something I've actually worked with, and I've been able through the years to go from I am angry to I am aware of anger arising in my experience, or I'm aware of depression. I am not depressed. So like you said, that spaciousness, it's what a relief that is.
Yeah.
We still deal with these things, but just that little gap, it makes a world of difference. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as I said earlier, we're starting to rewire the brain, and then we're starting to actually be able to influence the regulation of the nervous system. So if you've had a big adrenaline dump or cortisol, it's going to take some time for that to get processed through your body.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing people need to understand, is that the more that you understand how the neurophysiology works, the more you see that once you've had an adrenaline rush, it's going to take some time for that to get processed. But still, that witnessing awareness makes all the difference.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
Yes, seconded. Witness. That's great.
Yeah.
So I have two more book-specific questions for you.
Okay,
sure. I mean, I could sit here and talk to you all day about it, but I know your time is limited. So I appreciated the epigraph, actually. Very simple, but that began your 3 Perspectives, 3 Truths chapter. This is something I've discussed quite a bit with people. And it simply read, there are 3 sides to every story, yours, mine, and the truth. And that was quoted to Unknown. That is such a simple but profound statement, for people to really take into consideration. There's my experience of what's happening, there's yours, and then there's the impartial experience. So again, if you could talk a bit about that, I'd love it.
Well, what we discover is that when we make distinctions, we can actually have a more whole experience. So when we make a distinction between the first person I, the second person you, and the third person it, those are, as Ken Wilber likes to point out, those are the 3 perspectives framed by language. So we're always participating with those 3 fundamental perspectives. The problem is we don't know it. So, as a woman, I'm very much in the business of telling men how they feel. Right? So you are upset and you don't know it. Like I move into second person and impose my view onto you. And inevitably that feels like an oppression. Yeah. So just to notice that, wait, I am noticing at least that from where I'm standing, it seems like you're mad. That's a very different statement, right, than to say you are. Yeah. Or, for instance, we conflate our first-person truths with third-person all the time. So someone will say, we're in a retreat right now, so someone will say, I really enjoyed this part of the talk. And someone else will say, oh, the discussion of Sangha practice was the best part. And they move to third person. Well, what happens when you express that in third person is you automatically set up disagreement because other people will have a different point of view. Then the question becomes, well, if you're going to use a third person discourse, you've got to have verifications because third person requires that. So you would have to maybe take a poll, but even then you're still in the realm of the subjective, So science is built, empiricism is built on that third person perspective, and we rely on it for many, many things. But we don't want to conflate it with second. with what you and I may agree about, and we don't want to conflate it with the first person perspective. So lots of times in a disagreement, if I can simply ask people to move from speaking in third person absolute truths and into first person relative truths, subjective experience, subjective perception, there's a lot more space just to exchange points of view. And lots of people in postmodern culture know how to do that. I would venture to say not a lot of people do it well.
Right. Well, great point. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we're just beginning to learn it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And as you mentioned, we at a lot of Ken Wilber's work is great around that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you started to talk a bit about relative experience, and I think that segues nicely into my next question, where it's in the Everything and Nothing chapter, and you address what Zen refers to as big mind. And I also appreciate that you note that others have given it different names, and you give the example of Eckhart Tolle calls it presence, Ken Wilber calls it ever-present awareness, Byron Katie simply calls it reality. So I know this is a very tricky topic, to actually put into words, but if we could talk about the importance of cultivating our experience of big mind, of emptiness, of the two truths, I think they're all kind of together in a sort of, if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that'd be great.
All right. So far we've been talking about just the challenges of being in relationship and the fact that we have conflicts with one another. And meditation is really designed to teach us, if you will, or to show us how to participate in a unified experience in which the dualistic mind, the subject, the object, the you, the me, the this, the that, actually settles down, and we can start to feel the well-being that comes from having a kind of experience of the whole, right? So that because in a certain way, the function in human beings, our language function, our linguistic function, our cognition, in a certain way, has created so many amazing things, or has revealed so many amazing things like mathematics and so many things. At the same time, whenever there is a dualism, there's tension.
Yeah.
It could be creative tension, it could be aggression, whatever it is, but there's tension. So meditation is about quieting that linguistic function, coming into the present moment, opening the senses, stabilizing the mind, and allowing the innate well-being of the meditative state, becoming deeper and deeper that state. And then we can start to perceive wholeness off the cushion. So there's a quality that you're experiencing wholeness all the time now, even though you're not in a sitting practice. So when a conflict comes up, there's a greater space to deal with that conflict. It's like you were just saying, I can feel my relative position, I can feel yours, and I can feel a greater field in which this conflict is being held. And it just kind of shifts the possibility or the opportunity, you might say.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great explanation. Very user-friendly, so I appreciate that.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
try to be user-friendly.
I know, it's tricky. Like I said, it's a tough one to put into words, but thank you. That was great.
Okay.
So, we've already discussed a little bit about Ken Wilber.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you in a minute about the recent Fourth Turning Conference that you did. But before we get into that, I know that his work, as you've already said, it had a big impact in your own spiritual life and understanding and experience. So if you can talk a little bit about that, how did that help open you up? And I think it's wonderful that you're, a Zen practitioner, and but you can also look at the Sufis and the Christian mystics and take it all in. And yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I met Ken in 2004, and it was a little bit unbidden in the sense that a person that I knew was working with Ken on integral politics. He came to a Big Mind session that I had set up with my teacher, Genpo Roshi, and then John Kessler is his name. He thought it would be wonderful for Ken and Genpo Roshi to meet. So in 2004 they met, or late 2003, and I was part of that. I was the person that set up that original kind of meeting. And what happened is it changed my practice in a number of kind of substantial ways. One was I had always kind of seen human beings as struggling to awaken spiritually and having these kind of incredible, amazing, beautiful teaching, and not doing all that well. There's if we think about the number of wars on the planet at any one time, if we think about the number of people in poverty, if we think about the degradation of the environment. So what happened was that my consideration changed because I started to see human beings on the spectrum of 13.8 billion years of evolution. Planet Earth, 4.8 billion years of evolution. Human beings, 200,000 years. These sets of spiritual teachings coming into consciousness. Well, shamanic understanding coming online anywhere from 20 to 60,000 years ago. And then, Hinduism, Judaism, 10,000, 5,000. And then, Christianity and innovation comes online 3,000 years ago. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, wow. On a spectrum of 13.8 billion years, for life to build itself up to this level of complexity, and then to start to refine itself and to start to understand the principles of the universe, like my whole experience of a struggling spiritual seeker just changed. I'm like, oh wow, I'm like, we're the latest innovation, and we're no question we're in an evolving situation.
Yeah.
And but it just kind of it lightened me up.
That's great.
To see that. Yeah. It's really great. It's like I see that, some people say that the Hubble telescope is really sort of the metaphor for human beings to be able to now start to take a perspective not only on ourselves, but on our place in the universe. And that our place, like suddenly, even 50 years ago, people didn't experience themselves on this planet, in this solar system. Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about our cosmic address. Yeah. Ken talks about our cosmic address. Like, we're actually seeing ourselves differently. That's a big deal in my mind. It's inspiring. I'm energized because of it.
Yeah.
Now, the Lotus Sutra, I think, suggests a lot of this. The great Mahayana Sutras suggest this kind of grand scale, but I didn't tend to think in those kinds of grand scales.
That's wonderful. How exciting. Like you said, it's really a wonderful time to be alive and to watch the unfolding. Yeah. So the last thing we'll discuss then is, so you were just, you took part in Ken's 4th Turning Conference out in, was it Denver? I know it's Colorado. Boulder.
It was Boulder, yeah.
In Boulder. And I've read the ebook. I personally appreciated it deeply. I know there's feedback on both sides. Some people really like it, some people don't. So I would love to get your take on it, since you're right there in the thick of it. If you can talk a bit about what the 4th Turning is and your involvement and how you're experiencing it and seeing it.
Well, first of all, I'll just locate my cosmic address.
Yeah.
I'm a working stiff in the Dharma. I'm not a great realized Buddhist teacher, nor am I a great scholar, nor do I have anything remotely like the genius of Ken Wilber. So, the Buddhist tradition and Ken Wilber, let's just say a lot of homage to that, to those two geniuses. So in terms of a historical and a scholarly point of view, I think some people argue with this notion of a 4th turning. Is it truly the 4th? Is there a 4th turning? Has there already been a 4th turning? Why even use that particular language? I think the reason that Ken uses that language is because turning itself implies evolution. It implies change. There's a dynamic quality to turning. When in your life did you turn towards something? When did you turn away from something? In Zen, we talk about a turning word. So the word turning has historical resonance. It may, for some people, not land quite accurately. Some people say the 3 turnings really apply to the Mahayana tradition in terms of the original set of Buddhist teachings, then the Nagarjuna's insights, and the form is emptiness, and the inclusion of samsara in nirvana. The 3rd turning, Ken places it with Yogacara within the Mahayana tradition, which to some degree, I guess, would describe the way in which the recognition of emptiness or consciousness, something or nothing, how it actually becomes manifest and enacted perhaps in the world, which you find in Zen. It's not called a turning, but there's definitely that sense of dynamic manifestation, that it's not enough to realize. Realization must be manifested. So that's my very, very naive understanding of those 3 turnings. So I think what we could safely say is that there's an encounter of Buddha Dharma, the great wisdom tradition of Buddhism, with the West. And anybody who is practicing Buddhism knows that change is afoot. Modernity is affecting Buddhism. all the brain science that's online, Rick Hanson's books, all the His Holiness talking, his Mind Science Institute. So science is affecting us. That we know that's happening. Postmodernism is affecting how Buddhist practice is happening. Women are now sitting in zendos with men. That's having an effect. I'm sorry, it just is.
Yeah,
On
true.
an absolute level, of course, it's empty. But on a relative level, if you bring women into leadership, or you bring women, there's a lot of research that's been done that says around the world, if you put money into the hands of women, it goes more directly into the hands of children. That's a big deal if you're a person doing international development. You want to know that. So modern influences, postmodern influences. The fourth turning is really a description, I think, of Ken's label for the encounter of Asian Buddha Dharma with the West. And it's been going on now since the late 1800s, as we know, and there was a big flowering of Buddha Dharma. And now it's, Buddha Dharma is everywhere, and mindfulness is on the cover of the New York Times and Time Magazine. So
Right.
it's, we're in it.
Yeah.
Now, is it presumptuous to describe a historical turning when you're in it? It's another complaint people would make, is like, how much hubris does that take? Well, from one point of view, yes, because you can't know. You can only know it retrospectively. But what's subtle and what's beautiful is human beings are only capable of seeing themselves as part of evolution now. Darwin was 150 years ago. Understanding the Big Bang is 40 to 50 years old at the most. So experiencing ourselves in a process of evolution actually deserves to be noted. Not in terms of the hubris of a historical movement, but rather, what does it mean to feel ourselves in this question? And I would venture to say, at least in America, that every person who's teaching Zen or teaching Tibetan Buddhism or even Vipassana made very strong decisions around how to work with this encounter early on. So we're all living it. Do we agree with the language of it? Maybe not, but we're all living it. And will we know what it is? No, we can't, because we're in it. It's a first person, not a second person.
Yeah.
So I always have people say, where is the first turning in your life? When did you empty out and become free? When did your compassion come online? How are you manifesting this in the world? And how are you holding the questions of this great encounter between East and West? So
Beautiful. Well, thank you for that.
you can tell I've thought about it.
Yes, you have. And I appreciate that very thoughtful response. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Diane.
Yeah.
So, I know you're on retreat now. Do you have any other upcoming events that you'd like to share with viewers, or where can people find you to check out what you have going on online? Anything you'd like to share with them?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, I'm going to be at Harvard next week.
Cool.
So if you're in the Boston area, there's an event at Samadhi, which is an integral salon. So if you're on the East Coast and you want to come to that, check out Samadhi online. I think it's on Thursday night next week. And then we have the Integral Living Room in Boulder, and that really is we have a view that conversations are ontological objects, and to have new conversations actually creates new realities. So we have this thing called the Integral Living Room, and Ken will be there, and that's at the end of May in Boulder, and you can find that online. And then I do a big event in the summer called Three Faces of Spirit. The first week is complete Zen practice. The second week is all relational and intimacy practice with a little bit of sexuality, just enough not to cause a scandal. And then the third week is nature-based mysticism practices.
Sounds great.
So those are the ones I would shout out.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Diane,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time. It's been a sincere pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for all the work you bring into the world. It's definitely greatly appreciated on many levels.
My
So
pleasure.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye.